There is a kind of woman the world mistakes for soft. She shows up on time, she keeps the house warm, she smiles at dinner parties and never corrects her husband in front of his friends. The world looks at her and sees someone who can be managed. What the world doesn't see is what happens when she stops managing her feelings and starts managing her exit. Celeste Okafor was that woman. 31 years old, a former supply chain analyst for a pharmaceutical distributor in Mississauga, Ontario. She had given up a director-track position 3 years earlier, at the quiet insistence of her husband Rhett, who had a way of framing sacrifices as gifts. "You don't need the stress, Celeste. I make enough for both of us. Think of what you could do with that time." What she did with that time was raise their daughter, Ivy, manage a 4-bedroom house in Oakville, and slowly, quietly, watch the man she married turn into someone she didn't recognize. The first sign wasn't dramatic, it never is. It was a receipt she found tucked into the inner pocket of Rhett's charcoal wool coat while she was taking it to the dry cleaner. Not for a hotel, not for lingerie. It was for a weekend pottery class at a studio in the Distillery District in Toronto. $45 paid in cash, dated a Saturday when Rhett had told her he was in a client retreat in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Celeste stood in the mudroom with the coat in one hand and the receipt in the other. Ivy was napping upstairs. The house smelled like the chicken she had put in the slow cooker that morning. She didn't feel rage, not yet. She felt something colder and more precise than rage. She felt the click of a mechanism falling into place. She put the receipt back exactly where she found it. She took the coat to the dry cleaner. She came home, finished folding laundry, and when Rhett walked in that evening full of stories about the wine tasting and the client golf round, she listened, nodded, and asked how his back felt after all that walking. That night while he slept, she went downstairs and opened her laptop. She didn't start with his phone or his email. She started with herself. Before she and Rhett married, Celeste's mother had sat her down and made her read every line of the marriage contract and the property agreement they were signing. Her mother was a retired accountant from Brampton, who had grown up watching women in her family sign things they didn't understand and spend the rest of their lives paying for it. "You read everything," her mother had told her. Especially when someone says it's just a formality. Celeste had been grateful for that lesson in the abstract. Now she was grateful for it in the specific. She opened the folder on her personal drive she hadn't touched in 3 years. The postnuptial agreement Rhett had proposed 18 months into their marriage, when he launched his consulting firm and wanted to restructure their financial exposure. He had explained it warmly over a nice dinner at a restaurant in Burlington. A way to protect them both, he said. He had his lawyer draft it. He told her she could have her own lawyer look it over. She had briefly, but she had not read it the way her mother meant. She had read it the way a person reads a terms of service agreement. She read it now line by line. She read it the way her mother meant. There was a clause on page 7. It had been written in the specific language of legal drafting, the kind that blurs into the surrounding paragraphs if you're not trained to look for it. It stated that in the event of demonstrable marital misconduct, defined broadly to include sustained deception affecting the welfare of the dependent spouse, the aggrieved party retained the right to a full audit and equitable reassignment of all shared and jointly titled assets, including the matrimonial home. Celeste sat back in her chair. She closed the laptop. She went back upstairs. She got into bed beside her husband and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The next morning she drove Ivy to daycare, and then she drove to the office of a family law lawyer in downtown Hamilton named Vivienne Tran, whose name she had found in a legal aid resource article 3 weeks earlier, and memorized for no reason she could name at the time. "I need to understand what I'm entitled to," Celeste told her. "Before I know anything for certain, before I do anything at all." Vivienne had looked at her with the calm, assessing gaze of a woman who had heard variations of this sentence many times. "Tell me about your marriage," she said, "and tell me about the agreement." Celeste told her everything. When she was done, Vivienne leaned back in her chair and said, "If what you're describing is accurate and documented, that clause is enforceable. But the documentation matters. Without it, you have a conversation. With it you have leverage." "How much time do I have?" Celeste asked. "How much time do you need?" She needed 5 months. She did not confront Rhett. She did not ask questions she wasn't ready to have answered on his terms. She went home and she became the best version of the wife he thought she was. Attentive, warm, uncomplicated. She cooked the meals he liked. She made conversation about his clients. She attended the dinner party his colleague hosted in Ancaster and laughed at the moments. And in the small hours, after Ivy was asleep and Rhett was watching the game or scrolling his phone with the particular slack-jawed blankness of a man who thinks he is unobserved, Celeste worked. She had kept a separate email account from before the marriage, a Proton address she had set up for a freelance project she never pursued. She reopened it. She contacted her former manager at the pharmaceutical distributor, a woman named Sandra, who had always told her the door was open. She explained carefully that she was exploring some personal transitions and asked whether any consulting arrangements might be possible. Sandra wrote back within an hour. "I was hoping you'd call," she said. "We have a contract that starts in April. It's yours if you want it." She said she'd be in touch. She also called her mother. Not to tell her what was happening, not yet. She called to ask about the money her grandmother had left in trust. The family trust that Celeste's mother controlled, that Celeste was a named beneficiary of, and that Rhett had tried twice gently and without success to fold into their joint financial planning. "Is any of it accessible?" she asked. "All of it," her mother said. "I've been waiting for you to ask." The pottery class led to a name. She found it herself eventually, by going through the cloud backup of photos, synced to their shared family account, a backup Rhett had set up 2 years ago and clearly forgotten about. His phone uploaded everything automatically. She scrolled back through months of images looking for what didn't fit, and she found it in November. A photo taken inside a restaurant she didn't recognize, a glass of wine, and across the table, a hand. A woman's hand, a silver ring on the third finger but not a wedding ring. A ring Celeste had never seen before. The restaurant was identifiable by the distinctive mosaic tile visible in the background. She found it in 20 minutes. A place called Fable on King Street West in Toronto. She hired an investigator. His name was Patrick, a retired OPP officer who worked out of a small office in Stony Creek. He was thorough and not cheap. Within 3 weeks he gave her a name, Nora Beaumont, 34 years old, an interior design consultant. She and Rhett had been seeing each other for at least 14 months. Celeste looked at the photographs Patrick laid on his desk and she felt something close to relief. The proof was clean, the timeline was clear, it was enough. "I don't need anything else from you," she told Patrick. She thanked him. She paid the invoice in full from her personal savings. The account Rhett didn't know still existed because she had never closed it and he had never thought to ask. She called Sandra and confirmed the consulting contract. She called Vivienne and said she was ready. What happened next took 10 days. Celeste planned every hour of it the way she used to plan logistics for a regional pharmaceutical distribution network across 4 provinces. The house was in both their names, but the mortgage was paid primarily through Rhett's business income, and that business income had several structural vulnerabilities that Vivienne had identified and documented. Had the family trust, which Celeste's mother now agreed to activate on Celeste's behalf, gave her independent financial footing. She wasn't leaving with nothing. She was leaving with everything she had quietly, patiently, legally secured. She found a rental property in Burlington, semi-detached near a good school. She signed the lease under her maiden name, Okafor, a name she had never legally changed and which now felt like something she had kept safe for a reason. She arranged for a moving company to come on a Thursday, a day Rhett had a standing client meeting in Toronto, that ran from 10 in the morning until at least 4 in the afternoon. She confirmed the meeting was still on his calendar. It was. She called Rhett's mother, with whom she had always had a careful, cordial relationship, and told her that she and Ivy were going to visit a friend in Hamilton for a few days. Rhett's mother said that sounded nice. She asked Celeste to give Ivy a hug from her. On the Wednesday evening before, Celeste made dinner. She made the lemon chicken Rhett had always said was his favorite, the recipe his own mother had given her years ago. She set the table properly. Ivy ate with them and talked at length about a book her daycare teacher had read that morning, a story about a mouse who built a house out of cheese. Rhett laughed at the right parts. Celeste watched him laugh and thought, "You have no idea." After Ivy was in bed, she sat across from Rhett in the living room while he watched the Maple Leafs lose, which they did with reliable frequency, and she said, "I love this house." He glanced at her. "Good," he said. "Me too." She nodded and went to bed. The next morning she made Ivy's breakfast, packed her bag and dropped her at her mother's in Brampton. She told Ivy they were going on a little adventure, that Grandma's house was the first stop. Ivy was 3 and considered any deviation from routine a potentially positive development. She went willingly, asking only whether Grandma had the cereal with the blueberries. Celeste drove back to the house in Oakville. The moving company arrived at 10:15. She had color-coded the rooms. Blue tags for the Burlington house, yellow tags for storage, red tags for Rhett. The red tags covered almost nothing. A box of his golf equipment, his rack of suits, his file cabinet from the home office. The rest was hers, documented by Vivienne as either personal property predating the marriage, items purchased with trust funds, or items under dispute pending legal proceedings. By 2 in the afternoon, the house was nearly empty. She walked through it room by room. Where Ivy had slept since she was 4 days old was stripped down to a single mobile she had deliberately left hanging. The one shaped like small silver fish that caught the light from the window. She wasn't sure why she left it. She just couldn't take it down. She let herself stand in the empty living room for a moment. long enough to feel the particular silence of a space cleared of all accumulated pretending, and then she walked out. She locked the front door. She left one key on the front step, tucked under the doormat, and she mailed the other to Vivienne. She drove to Burlington. Rhett came home at 6:17, 45 minutes later than usual, because he had stopped to pick up wine for a dinner he had mentioned that morning, a dinner Celeste had told him she was excited about. He had a bottle of something he thought was nice. He was in a decent mood. He had a good meeting. He was thinking about telling Celeste they should book something over March break. Maybe Banff. He put his key in the lock. It didn't turn. He tried again. He stepped back and looked at the door, the way a person looks at a thing they don't understand yet. He tried the garage door code. The panel beeped 3 times and nothing moved. He walked around to the back patio. The door was locked. He cupped his hands to the sliding glass and looked into the kitchen. The island was bare. The stool where Ivy always sat was gone. He stood very still. Then he ran around to the front and crouched down to look through the sidelight window beside the front door. The hallway floor was empty. The coat hooks were clear. The bench where Ivy's rain boots always sat in a crooked little row was gone. He dialed Celeste. The message he heard was not her voicemail. It was a new recording made the previous afternoon. Her voice was calm and clear and very specific. Rhett, by the time you're hearing this, Ivy and I are settled. I know about Nora. I know about the pottery class, the Fable dinners, the hotel in Niagara. I have 14 months of documentation. Vivienne Tran at the Hamilton Law Office has been retained on my behalf. She will be in touch about next steps regarding the house and the remaining assets. Please don't try to contact me directly. My number is changing. Any communication about Ivy's welfare should go through Vivienne. Goodbye. The recording ended. Rhett stood on the front step with the bottle of wine in one hand and his phone in the other, and the Oakville night, settling cold and early the way it does in February in Ontario. The wind off the lake had teeth. He called Celeste's number again. The line rang once, then disconnected. He called her mother's number. It went to voicemail. He called his own lawyer, a man named Greg Ossie at a firm in downtown Toronto, and Greg answered on the 4th ring sounding like someone who had been pulled out of his own dinner. Rhett, what's going on? She left. She took everything. She changed the locks. I can't get into my own house. There was a pause on Greg's end, the kind that tells you the person on the other side is choosing their words with care. Okay. Have you seen anything from her lawyer? Not yet. She said of Vivienne Tran, Hamilton. Another pause. I know Vivienne Tran, Greg said quietly. Is that bad? Greg didn't answer that. Rhett, were there any agreements you two signed during the marriage? A postnuptial? Rhett felt something cold move through him. Yeah, we signed something when I started the firm, but it was just to protect the business. Mutual protection. I'm going to need to see that document, Greg said. Tonight if possible. I don't have it. It's in the file cabinet, which is inside the house. Do you have a digital copy? She may have it. There was a third pause, longer than the others. When Greg spoke again, his voice had shifted into the register of a professional who has seen a situation like this before, and does not enjoy being the one to explain what it means. Rhett, I need you to understand something. Until I've seen that document, I can't advise you on your options. But if she has retained Vivienne Tran and she's invoking a misconduct clause in that agreement, the next few weeks are going to require a lot of patience on your end. Don't contact her. Don't go to the Burlington address if you find it. Don't contact Nora. Don't post anything anywhere. Can you do that? I don't even have a place to sleep, Rhett said. Greg let out a slow breath. Do you have a friend you can call? He called 3. The first didn't answer. The second was away in Scottsdale with his family until Sunday. The third, a colleague from his consulting network named Frank, said sure, there was a pull-out couch, but his wife Donna could be heard in the background asking who was calling and why, and the conversation became complicated quickly. Frank told him to come anyway, awkwardly, and Rhett drove to Frank and Donna's house in Milton and slept on a pull-out couch that sagged in the middle and smelled faintly of the dog they had owned until 2 years ago and still talked about as though it were a recently lost family member. He lay on that couch and looked at the dark ceiling and tried to think of what he still had. He had his car, he had his phone, which was currently receiving notifications from the work email he hadn't checked. He had his wallet, which contained $412 in cash and 3 credit cards, 2 of which were corporate cards attached to the business account and one of which was the joint personal card he shared with Celeste. He tried the joint card online at 2 in the morning to see if it worked. It had been flagged pending legal review. It did not work. The business account was fine, for now. But Vivienne Tran, as he would discover over the following weeks, was a thorough woman. She had already begun the audit Celeste had quietly commissioned in January, which traced 18 months of consulting expenses that included, among other things, hotel charges in Niagara, a weekend in Montreal logged as a client development trip, and 4 charges at a pottery studio in Toronto's distillery district that had been expensed as team-building activities. Rhett's accountant called him 11 days later, sounding worried for the first time Rhett could remember. The legal process was not fast. These things never are. But the shape of it was clear very quickly, and the shape of it was not in Rhett's favor. The postnuptial agreement he had proposed, drafted by his own lawyer and handed to Celeste with the explanation that it was mutual protection, contained language that Celeste had found on page 7 and Vivienne Tran had spent 3 months learning to wield. Rhett tried, in the early weeks, to reach Celeste through intermediaries. He sent a long message through her cousin, a woman in Scarborough with whom Celeste had always been close, explaining that he was willing to talk, that things had gotten complicated, that he wanted to work something out for Ivy's sake. The cousin passed the message to Celeste verbatim, as Celeste had asked her to. Celeste read it. She did not respond to it. She was by that point, 3 weeks into the consulting contract with her old employer, working from a dedicated home office in the Burlington semi-detached she had furnished, incrementally, over the previous 2 months using purchases she had made in cash and stored at her mother's house. The office had a standing desk, a good monitor, and a window that looked out onto a small backyard where Ivy's new daycare had noticed she liked to dig in the dirt and had suggested gently that perhaps a little garden plot might be a nice project. Celeste had thought about that. She bought a small set of child-sized gardening tools at a shop in Burlington's downtown strip and tucked them behind the back door for spring. She called Sandra that afternoon and told her the contract role might be available for extension if the company was interested. Sandra said they were very interested. She asked how Celeste was doing, in the careful way of a manager who means the question genuinely. Celeste said she was doing all right, that things were in motion, that she was figuring it out. Sandra said she was glad. She also said, while she had her on the phone, that a permanent position was being created in the Q3 planning cycle, and that Celeste's name had already come up in the internal conversation. She wanted her to know. Celeste thanked her. She hung up and stood in her kitchen in Burlington. In a house that smelled like the curry she had made for dinner, and the slight damp of a February evening, and she felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Not triumph. Something quieter and more durable than triumph. Something that felt like the return of a self she had loaned out and not expected to get back. She called her mother that night after Ivy was in bed. Her mother answered on the first ring, the way she always did, the way she had for every important phone call of Celeste's life, as though she had been waiting. "How are you doing?" her mother asked. "I'm okay," Celeste said, and for the first time in a long time, she meant it without reservation. "Is Ivy okay? She found a worm in the backyard today and named it Gerald. She's devastated it went back into the ground." Her mother laughed. "She gets that from your father's side, he named things too, couldn't help himself." There was a short silence, comfortable and familiar. "He didn't know what he had," her mother said then, not harshly, just as a statement of observable fact, the way her mother said most true things. "No," Celeste agreed, "he didn't." The divorce was finalized 7 months later in September, on a day when the light in Burlington was the particular gold of early fall. The property was assessed, the assets divided, the support arrangement established. Celeste's returning to full professional employment had been factored into the arrangements in ways that were equitable and carefully argued by Vivienne, who was, as Greg Ossie had implied on that first terrible phone call on Rhett's front step, extremely good at her job. Rhett had moved into a rental apartment in Mississauga. The consulting firm was still operating, reduced in scope, navigating the accounting review. He had not, to Celeste's knowledge, continued seeing Nora Beaumont, who had ended things abruptly in March, approximately 2 weeks after learning that Rhett's assets were under legal dispute. Celeste had not asked how she knew this. She didn't need to. On the day the divorce was finalized, Celeste drove home to Burlington after signing the last of the papers. She stopped at a bakery near the house and bought a small cake, one of the ones with the vanilla frosting and the little sugar flowers, the kind Ivy would lose her mind over. She picked Ivy up from daycare. Ivy was wearing a coat that was one size too big, the orange one she had insisted on because of the fox on the pocket, and she came running out with the particular full-body enthusiasm of a 3.5-year-old who has had a very important day involving both finger painting and a new friend named Bia. They sat at the kitchen table together and ate the cake. Ivy got frosting on her chin and on the fox on her pocket and on the table and, somehow, in her hair. Celeste did not worry about the table. She got a warm cloth and cleaned Ivy's face while Ivy submitted with the stoic patience of someone who has accepted that this is part of the deal. "Good?" Celeste asked. "So good," Ivy said. "Can we get cake again tomorrow?" "Not tomorrow," Celeste said, "but for your birthday." "When's my birthday?" "A few months." Ivy considered this. "That's a long time." "It'll come," Celeste said. "It always does." She washed the plates. She put Ivy to bed. She sat in the kitchen in the quiet that settled over a house after a child falls asleep. A quiet that is not empty but full, layered with crayons and small boots and the smell of dinner, and something she could only call the particular weight of a life that is actually genuinely hers. She didn't feel like celebrating. She didn't feel like crying. She felt, in the most uncomplicated and complete way she had felt anything in years, like herself. Some people mistake silence for surrender. They see a woman who doesn't fight back, and they assume she has nothing left to fight with. What they don't understand is that the most effective kind of planning is the kind that looks from the outside, exactly like patience. Red thought he was managing her. He thought he had built something she couldn't leave. What he had actually done was give her 5 months, a document with a clause on page 7, and just enough underestimation to work with. She didn't burn anything down. She just stopped holding it up.